I'm not in the business. I am the business.
What of situations in which women are the technology? Physical beings that result from technology as an external power, who function as a male problem to solve. We'll explore this question through 3 movies. In chronological order, they are Andrei Tarkovsky's 1972 film Solaris, the 1982 film Blade Runner by Ridley Scott, and Steven Soderbergh's 2002 adaptation of Solaris. Each film has a male protagonist and an artificially manufactured woman, whose appearance and behavior conform, at least initially, to male projections of female norms. Hari, Rachel, and Rheya at least initially provide a narrative dilemma for these men. But through them, we also find a different story unfolding, a different thought process through the absurdity. Memory and emotion express themselves as shapes of hearing and listening in thought and reverie. When we shift the emphasis and consider their actions and thoughts, they stop fulfilling the role of being the muse of men and become their own subjects. In Was heißt Denken, Heidegger conjures Friedrich Hölderlin's conjuring of the myth of Mnemosyne, the embodiment of memory in Greek mythology. Heidegger notes that in Mnemosyne, memory is not simply all that can be thought. It has an element of care in its gathering and thinking back, so that it can give birth to poetry. Mnemosyne is distinctly bound to music, the hymn, the telling of the word, or the song. One gathers and conjures what is audible through hearing and listening. To be audible is to have a relation with memory. Well before Plato, in the ancient Greek and Sanskrit tradition, memory carries an element of anxiety, care, and trouble, the bothered mind who remembers. Hearing is the agitating and agitated channel that spurs the mind to gather within an experience of unseeing. Memory is where we find our sense of self and our audible relation to the world that gives rise to thought. In Blade Runner, Deckard tells Rachel what she already suspects. Her memories are not her own. He speculates that they belong to the niece of Dr. Eldon Tyrell, who is the head of the corporation she works for, and she comes to realize the man who manufactured her. In Tarkovsky's Solaris, Harry's mind is also composed of another's memories, those of her husband Kelvin. On Earth, she had committed suicide, but the Solaris consciousness reconstitutes her in physical form. The 3 films provide an allegory for the male dilemma. The male drive to understand and solve the problem is broken by the absurdity of the situation. Lem's novel is about a total lack of communication between human and alien, coupled with the absurdity of appealing to rational methods of overcoming this divide. The alien consciousness is simply too alien for human reasoning and empirical science. Yet the men can't find any other way through the problem. The cosmic distance plays out at the human level through the artificial lives who emerge on the station. Hari and Rheya are devoid of what Beauvoir calls a projection of authenticity and act as free and true beings that men are able to invent in their minds. Solaris' Hari appears as what Zizek calls the male scenario of woman as a symptom of man. But he adds further that the planet has done this to him, functioning as a symbol of the impenetrable other thing that has always been with him unconsciously at the deepest, most incommunicable level. This analysis holds when we consider Solaris from Kelvin's perspective. Lem's novel and all 3 films suggest that these women exist for men because they are beautiful and self-aware, and because they satisfy the psychological cathexis of the men's libidinal drives. But to understand them, we need to consider their own expressions of self. Here we can think of audibility less as one's physical, affective relationship to sonic events, and more in a poetic sense, as a concept for a mode of thinking. Memory is conceptually aligned with hearing, while thinking is an expression of listening. The former gives the latter an experiential richness that the women of these films express. Lacking their own early childhood memories of actual experiences, Rachel, Hari, and Rheya circumvent the standard definitions of a self. The women of Solaris seem to be a blank slate in regards to identity, only existing as a reflection of Kelvin's imagined memory of them. In Blade Runner, childhood and young adult memories are programmed, albeit as data that produces in Rachel an illusion of experience. In both cases, we have to distance ourselves from Heidegger. Memory and experience are not the same. We also have to consider a distinction between memory and language, and the different definitions of programming. In the human world, all our language comes from others. Language is the result of conditions imposed and implanted by our mothers, fathers, friends, media, government, teachers. Experience comes to memory in a direct sensory involvement. Language can also be sensory, but it has its abstract form and conventions that are teachable. Language is what we have been instructed to listen to, while experience is a listening born out of a willingness to hear. Experience is entirely one's own. The programming that made Rachel, Hari, and Rheya are built by an external power. A corporation or a planet has gathered memory in acts of data mining and encoded it into human bodies. All the humans initially doubt the humanity of the sentient being because they recognize it as artificial. At the beginning of Blade Runner, Deckard protects this notion in himself by saying to Tyrell about Rachel, "How can it not know what it is?" In Soderbergh's film, the skeptical scientist is recast as a woman named Gordon. She is also aiming to preserve analytical distance, not always successfully. She alternates between calling Rheya she and it, depending on the situation. Kelvin protects himself by sending the first iteration of Hari into space, thereby eliminating his problem. Kelvin and Deckard initially distrust the object made for male gratification. The change comes when they gain deeper connections with them. In Solaris, by Zizek's reading, this is because of his sense of guilt over his wife's suicide. Another way to look at it is that his change occurs once she exhibits her own sense of identity that transcends both her earthly original and her programmed purpose on the station. This gives rise to the other conflict, that between the protagonists and the rationalists around them. Both Solaris and Blade Runner are about the futility of dealing with the unassailable structures of power into which we're thrown. The women in these films gain awareness of this existential condition and their possibilities within it. They do this by opening themselves to the hearing of memory. Those around them continue in futility to try to solve the dilemma, engaging in reason, talk, and listening. In each story, these others to the male dilemma become far more intriguing existential selves than the central male characters. They probe their origins, open their own processes of thinking, and question what it means to exist in this absurdity. They experience their memories, which is to say they listen to their hearing, to a past that is outside of language. They stop listening to the programming manufactured by others, stop listening to the reasoning of men, and begin to hear as themselves. Both women ultimately find their own sense of self and peace within such a discovery, outside what the men around them attempt to dictate or influence. They build their own forms of thought to experience their own lines of thinking. Only in experience does memory cease to be artificial and informational. From the time Rachel, Hari, and Rheya are born, they begin to experience their existence. They build from within themselves and become subjects, attaining their own conditional understandings. The experience of emotions is key to this process. In Blade Runner, emotion is a threat. The concern, as Deckard's boss Brian explains, is that in time the replicants might develop their own emotional responses. A 4-year lifespan is programmed to counteract this danger. But Rachel is different, presumably the first of her kind. Her programming surpasses the Nexus 6 replicants, which we can presume brings the capacity for emotional complexity. In Solaris, the second iteration of Hari is more self-aware than the first because she has time to experience her condition. Her emotions guide her toward a greater sense of clarity about who she is. A rational disregard of emotions is often a tool for maintaining male dominance over women, whether at the individual or structural level. Hari, Rachel, and Rheya are able to circumvent this through expressions of emotional complexity. On the one hand, they short-circuit the programming of their masters, and on the other, find an emotional, rational balance that the men around them lack. The men, meanwhile, become caricatures with their constant talking, explaining, and appeals to reason. They take on the function of automatons, in a sense servants, for a civil, rational society. When Deckard tells Rachel that her memories are not her own, She is resistant and emotionally shaken and leaves his apartment. However, in a later scene and after she has saved his life, Rachel sits at the piano as he sleeps, quieting language and opening her to the available silence. She approaches it in an impulsive way, as if realizing in that moment that she can hear the notes already from what she sees. The act of applying her hands to the keys reveals to her that she knows how to play. It's a willful act, perhaps done as a means of listening to her muse, finding her own imagining of this memory. As she plays, Deckard wakes up, then comes to her and says, "I dreamt music." She tells him that she remembers lessons, but didn't know whether she could play, acknowledging the divide within her between programming and experience. In this scene, she hears the muse and listens to it. It is suggested that Deckard is also a replicant, but he never comes to such understanding. He had his chances in his muse visitations, but they were visual. His unicorn dream memory occurs as he sits at the same piano, the same object of mnemonic agitation. But he shakes off the memory and moves on to his investigative work of looking for evidence in a photograph. Rachel is her own singularity. She knows that whomever I may be, I am all that I am. Hari is not Hari, but a representation of another outside herself. Whomever I am also someone I am not. Whoever this Solaris Hari is, she is conscious of her consciousness at the same time she is aware that she is designed for the consciousness of another. Because her past is Kelvin's recollection of her, she cannot initially be separated from him. She must always be frontal to his visual actuality in order to exist, to be empirically known. The first Hari is rationally discarded, but the second Hari gets more time to develop. Before she can, she reproduces the same fate of her original on Earth and ends her life in despair. Her rebirth before Kelvin's eyes marks a transformation point. This Hari begins to overcome her own self. As Lem writes, she eventually learns to let him out of sight, so long as she can hear his voice. And in Tarkovsky's film, she states that she can now be away from him. She lets go of the need to know, but more importantly, to get away from the person to whom her programming has bound her. This coincides with her growing independence in thought, which Snout recognizes. In Lem's novel, he tells Kelvin that the longer she's on the station, the more human and independent she'll become. She knows this as well, allowing emotion to guide her to this understanding. Her notions, thoughts, and language are different, both from his and from Earth Hari's. Steven Soderbergh's 2002 version of Solaris is a much different film than Tarkovsky's. It allows a hearing of memory to express itself through his treatment of the cinematic form. And in this sense, we come to identify with Rheya on her own terms. Soderbergh accomplishes this connection through cinematic overlaps of audibility, memory, and time. During Kelvin's first sleep on Solaris, we also journey through his first meeting with Rheya. Bypassing the conventions of flashback or dream sequence, Soderbergh composes a far more complex cinematic event. There are apparently two existing time frames at work, one on the Solaris station and another on Earth, which itself overlaps two separate settings and times. Yet it remains ambiguous whether this is flashback, dream, or more likely the moment that Kelvin's consciousness is being probed by Solaris. The layered montage progresses linearly, but what infuses the scene with its emotional significance and temporal coexistence is the treatment of the sound. Cliff Martinez's score and Soderbergh's editing of it functions less as non-diegetic music and more as a singular expression, one that gathers a coexistence of lived durations into a simultaneous cinematic moment. This allows the event to transcend simple audiovisual spectatorship, allowing us to become drawn into a reality in the process of its own unfolding. This isn't music we're listening to, it's a gathering of time. The extended duration unfolds as a single, vertically enriched, horizontal line of emotive and empathetic transversal, one that also maintains its independence from the visual imagery. The characters' voices similarly move through time independent of imagery. Most intriguing is the use of ambient sound, the sound of a film world's own reality. As the music fades and the ambient presence of Earth's urban environment rises, Soderbergh accomplishes 3 storytelling tasks in a single shot of Rheya walking across the room on Earth. 1. An attraction leading to a love interest. 2. A reintroduction of the character of Jabarian. And 3. Jabarian's expositional dialogue about the condition on Solaris. Soderbergh could have shown these scenes in sequential fashion. Instead, he keeps our viewership on her. Through his editing of music, ambience, and moving image, he has connected multiple unseeing actions in what, taken only visually, is a woman walking across a room. This walk is the moment Chris meets the love of his life at the same time he hears about the problems on Solaris, at the same time that he is having his mind probed by Solaris. As we cut back visually to his sleeping image, the ambience on Earth remains the audible component, as does their sparse dialogue. This cut reminds the spectator that this is a single moment, one that feels less seen and more heard. It's all happening now as much as it is then. But it is not merely a trick of the apparatus of cinema. It projects a kind of listening on the part of Kelvin's unconscious, and an eavesdropping on the part of Solaris. It is a listening that Solaris hears in its intrusion and its process of learning and rendering memory into the new embodiment of Rheya. This all builds the unspoken poesis of Soderbergh's adaptation of Lem's original novel. The past is not in the past. It comes to be real, in some crossover of memory, imagining, and finally embodiment. As the sequence continues with its audio-visual and temporal overlaps, it's as if cinema is compiling Rheya, recording Kelvin to her hard drive, actualizing her corporeally, and bringing her to life on the space station. Soderbergh continues this approach in later scenes. As we hold on her image, she listens to and imagines the memories of Earth Rheya's past, or at least Kelvin's version, but the sound is Earth ambience rather than the station's ambience. She is hearing the past and learning from it. Complicating things more, we the audience are also given different manifestations of temporal ambiguity. Is this thinking or is it cinema? We see through her suicide in the past. Kelvin wasn't there, so it's not his memory Solaris is sampling. It is either his imagining of what she did, which has become memory to him, Rheya creating her own images of the event, or a flashback. In most cases, what we're seeing is no longer Kelvin's programmed memory, but her imagination and thought. This is Soderbergh's transformation of her character. Through her eyes, we see her mind developing, recalling, and learning, in a sense listening to a past that has taken on its own life. She takes account and, in a sense, lives this rendering of the past that is coming forward in her in the present. It reminds us again of Mnemosyne. It is not Kelvin's memory now, but her attempt at finding her muse in the Platonic sense. This is Rheya's version of Hari conjuring her own questions about her existence, and Rachel's reading of the piano music and playing the keys in Blade Runner. All 3 women decide to make something of their imagined memory. Their striving is an attempt to take hold of their capacity to listen as themselves, rather than as the programming of others. In Blade Runner, it is the listening of her own music that she makes now. In Solaris, the listening of her own thinking that she makes now. Memory in its recollection imagines. Rachel overcomes her programmed self by choosing to take the emotional leap and fall in love. It's an act of defiance against her masters, one which also allows her to build her own memories. Solaris, Hari, Rheya instead choose to end her existence. We can criticize Lem's choice to remove the female problem, which ends the male dilemma, and fating her to tragic inevitability. The critique is valid if we only see them as the same as their Earth versions. But they have become different. These women are not the same ones who despaired over Kelvin abandoning them. They are instead born of the uniqueness of their experiences on Solaris. Perhaps their end comes in a clear awareness of the absurdity of the real condition. Hari Rheya has no option to flee with Kelvin. She is doomed to an endless repetition that confines the couple to a cycle of trauma that she no longer feels is theirs. She has no way out of what Zizek calls the impossible traumatic thing. If we view it as her decision, Rheya becomes, to borrow Beauvoir's language, the clear-headed person who decides her own act in full knowledge of the situation, one that does not require any approval. For Rheya, death is a sacrifice of the self to the self and the couple. Perhaps even more, this suicide becomes an act of redemption for the previous one. Zizek tells us that Tarkovsky's films have the theme of sacrifice at their core. Earth Rheya ended her life in misery over her partner. Solaris Rheya chooses to save them both from the absurd cycle. Kelvin might be the protagonist, but Rheya becomes the hero that allows him to live. Both Kelvins eventually give in to fantasy. In Tarkovsky's film, Kelvin ends up adrift on the surface of the planet. The fantasy comes in Kelvin releasing his intellectual distance from Solaris and surrendering to Zizek's otherness that is within himself. He has failed to regain her and their love, failed to communicate with Solaris, and failed to come to terms with his own conscious self. His fate is to end his life in a fantasy of his own making, or as Zizek writes, living with an otherness with which no contact is possible. Soderbergh's resolution is more ambiguous. Kelvin has regained her, but is it real or fantasy? The hopeful takeaway is that in dissolving her corporeal form, she became pure consciousness on Solaris. As he fell into the planet, so did she. Freed from the body, their love finds its transcendence.
We don't have to think like that anymore.
We cannot end without drawing ourselves back and addressing the meta-analysis that requires attention. There is a normative male consciousness at work throughout what is being presented. From the fiction writers who wrote the novels, to the script writers who rewrote them into the cinematic form, to the directors who envisioned and completed the films. All of the source material, screenplays, and films were made by men. This extends to me as well, the writer of this particular analysis, now being heard in the mind of the reader or listener. This may remind us again of Beauvoir in her account of the myths of women written by male writers who decide how the other is composed. Her description of Stendhal's humanist equality applies best in this situation. Rather than a woman's mystical value, she finds in his writing a free being as transcendent as man. Yet in all of the men she discusses, Beauvoir writes, the ideal woman will be she who embodies the most exactly the other able to reveal him to himself. The question then, in the Beauvoirian sense, is not her own being but her own becoming. To hear is to be open to possibilities, which brings a listening that is not closed but open to newness. The listening, recollecting, thinking, and acting that they do is only this hearing, this recollection, this thought, and this action. Does either character fulfill the man's objective in her conscious thoughts and actions? Or is she defining her own role? Who is learning, growing, and changing in these films, the men or the women? Who is taking account of the situation and thinking clearly through the processes and difficulties? Perhaps it's neither one nor the other, but two lines of expression, each person thinking, acting, and interacting with an independence that is in partnership with the other. From this angle, we see a different story, one which embraces love and all the complexity of feeling that it brings.